The late-night flight from Seattle to New York was supposed to be just another business trip, another crowded cabin, another anonymous journey between two cities filled with people carrying burdens nobody else could see. But before that flight landed, the life of a powerful CEO and a struggling single father would collide in a way neither of them could have imagined. And what happened afterward would leave an entire company shaken, expose a betrayal worth millions of dollars, and ultimately change 3 lives forever. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy inspiring stories about kindness, resilience, and unexpected human connections, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story. Now let's begin. The rain hammered against the giant glass windows of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Outside, aircraft lights reflected across the soaked runway like scattered stars. Inside the terminal, travelers hurried between gates, dragging suitcases behind them, eager to escape the storm. Among them stood Grace Holloway. At just 28 years old, Grace was already one of the most recognizable business leaders in America. As the youngest CEO in the history of Holloway Dynamics, she had built a reputation that intimidated competitors and impressed investors. To the public, she seemed untouchable, confident, brilliant, cold. The financial media had even given her a nickname, the Ice Queen of Holloway Tower. Most people assumed she didn't care. The truth was far different. Grace hadn't slept properly in nearly 3 days. A major acquisition deal in Seattle had collapsed after months of preparation. Investors were demanding explanations. Board members were questioning her decisions. Headlines were already beginning to speculate about whether she was losing control of the company. What nobody knew was that 6 months earlier, her father had died. Richard Holloway had built the company she now led, and the failed acquisition she had fought so hard to secure had been his idea. The last one. Since his death, Grace had buried herself in work so completely that she had never truly allowed herself to grieve. Every hour of every day was spent solving problems. Every conversation had a purpose. Every relationship felt transactional. And now, standing at gate B17 with exhaustion weighing on her shoulders, she felt emptier than she could remember. Meanwhile, near the back of the boarding line, another passenger waited quietly. His name was Caleb Ryan, 32 years old, a systems maintenance technician, a man few people would notice in a crowd. His navy jacket showed signs of years of use. His backpack was old but carefully maintained. His hands carried the rough calluses of someone who worked with tools rather than presentations. While Grace worried about shareholders and board meetings, Caleb worried about something much more personal, his 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Tucked safely inside one of the backpack pockets was a prescription bottle bearing her name. Lily suffered from a serious heart condition. For years, Caleb had worked multiple jobs to cover medical expenses, specialist appointments, and treatments that insurance didn't fully pay for. Every dollar mattered. Every hour mattered. Every decision revolved around one question. Would it help his daughter? Earlier that evening, Lily had called him before boarding. Her small face had appeared on the screen, smiling despite the challenges she faced. "Daddy," she'd whispered seriously, "don't forget the moon cookies." Caleb had laughed, then immediately written the reminder on the back of his boarding pass. Because forgetting wasn't an option, not when it came to Lily. As boarding began, fate quietly placed 2 completely different lives on the same row of the same aircraft. Grace Holloway, seat 14A. Caleb Ryan, seat 14B. Neither of them knew it yet, but before the night was over, one simple act of kindness would begin a chain of events that would transform everything they thought they understood about success, sacrifice, and what truly matters in life. And it would all begin somewhere above the clouds. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to like this video. It helps our channel reach more viewers and allows us to continue bringing you powerful stories like this one. Now, let's continue. The aircraft pushed back from the gate nearly 40 minutes behind schedule. Outside, Rain continued to lash against the fuselage as the plane slowly taxied toward the runway. Inside the cabin, most passengers settled into the familiar rhythm of a late-night flight. Some opened laptops. Others scrolled through their phones. A few immediately closed their eyes, hoping to sleep through the journey. Grace Holloway belonged to none of those groups. The moment she sat down in seat 14A, she opened her laptop and returned to work. Her inbox contained more than 200 unread emails. 3 board members had already requested emergency meetings. 2 investors wanted reassurances. A financial publication had published another article questioning her leadership less than an hour earlier. She read every message, answered every request, reviewed every report. The glowing screen illuminated her face, while the cabin lights gradually dimmed around her. Beside her, Caleb Ryan noticed none of it. Or rather, he noticed and chose not to intrude. After years of balancing hospital appointments, maintenance shifts, delivery routes, and endless responsibilities, he had developed a habit of respecting other people's battles. Even when he couldn't see them clearly, he settled into his seat, plugged in his headphones, and listened to a podcast discussing electrical grid systems. For a while, neither of them spoke. The aircraft climbed through heavy clouds. Turbulence rattled the cabin. Passengers shifted uneasily. A flight attendant reassured everyone that conditions would improve shortly. Grace barely looked up. Her fingers continued moving across the keyboard with relentless efficiency. But exhaustion is patient. It waits. And eventually, it always wins. Somewhere over Idaho, after nearly 3 days without meaningful rest, Grace's body finally reached its limit. Her eyes began to blur. The words on the screen lost their sharp edges. She blinked repeatedly, then again. And then her body made the decision for her. The laptop slipped slightly in her lap. Her shoulders relaxed. Her head tilted. Within seconds, Grace Holloway was asleep. Completely asleep. The transition happened so suddenly that she never realized it. Nor did she realize that her head had come to rest against Caleb's shoulder. Caleb felt the weight settle beside him. For a brief moment, he considered waking her. Most people probably would have. But then he looked at her face. The tension remained there even in sleep. The faint crease between her eyebrows. The exhaustion written into every feature. She looked less like a successful CEO and more like someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for far too long. So he made a simple choice. He stayed still. Carefully, he removed his jacket. The cabin temperature had dropped as the aircraft climbed higher. Without disturbing her, he draped the jacket gently across her shoulders. The motion was instinctive. It was the same movement he had performed thousands of times while covering Lily with blankets after she had fallen asleep on the couch. A nearby flight attendant noticed. As she passed through the aisle, she smiled softly. "Your wife looks exhausted," she whispered. Caleb glanced down at Grace, then back at the attendant. A faint smile appeared on his face. "She must be," he replied quietly. The attendant nodded and continued down the aisle. Neither of them bothered correcting the misunderstanding. For the next 40 minutes, the flight remained peaceful. Then the turbulence returned. This time, it was much worse. The aircraft suddenly dropped several feet. A collective gasp spread through the cabin. Overhead compartments rattled. Plastic cups trembled on tray tables. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a sharp chime. Passengers grabbed armrests. Some whispered nervous prayers. But Grace never woke. She slept through all of it. Caleb immediately realized she was vulnerable to the violent movement. If the turbulence worsened, she could easily slide into the aisle or strike the armrest. Without hesitation, he adjusted his position. One arm braced against the seat. The other remained carefully positioned to keep her stable. The aircraft lurched again. The edge of the armrest slammed into his forearm. Pain shot through his arm. He barely reacted. Another sudden movement followed. Again, the armrest struck him. A dark bruise slowly began forming beneath his sleeve. Still, he didn't move her, didn't wake her, didn't complain. He simply held his position. Across the aisle, another passenger watched the scene unfold. After several minutes, the man leaned forward. "Buddy," he muttered. Caleb looked over. The man nodded toward Grace. Just wake her up. Caleb glanced down at the sleeping woman beside him, then back at the passenger. She's okay, he said calmly. The passenger frowned. You're taking a beating over there. Caleb shrugged. She's sleeping, as though that explained everything. To him, it did. The other man stared for a moment before leaning back into his seat. Caleb returned his attention to the dark window beside him. Beyond the glass, moonlight reflected across an endless ocean of clouds. And as often happened during quiet moments, his thoughts drifted toward Lily. He remembered her laughter, the way she insisted every stuffed animal needed its own blanket, the way she bravely smiled after difficult hospital visits because she didn't want him to worry. He remembered the day doctors first explained her condition, the fear, the uncertainty, the overwhelming realization that his entire life had changed in a single conversation. Many people would have broken under that pressure. Some had. His marriage certainly had. 14 months earlier, Lily's mother had left. Not during an argument, not during a dramatic confrontation. She had simply called and said she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't handle the hospitals, couldn't handle the stress, couldn't handle the life they had been given. The call lasted less than 10 minutes. Afterward, Caleb had sat alone on the kitchen floor for nearly an hour. Then he stood up, made dinner for Lily, and kept moving forward, because that's what fathers do. At least, that's what he believed. Beside him, Grace shifted slightly in her sleep. One hand loosely caught the edge of his sleeve. The gesture was small, almost childlike. For a moment, Caleb looked at her, not as a CEO, not as a stranger, just as another human being who seemed profoundly tired. And in that instant, he recognized something familiar. Loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, the deeper kind. The loneliness that comes from carrying responsibilities nobody else fully understands. He knew that feeling well, very well. The remainder of the flight passed quietly. Eventually, the turbulence faded. The cabin lights brightened. Passengers began gathering belongings. Announcements echoed overhead as the aircraft prepared for landing. Slowly, Grace began to wake. At first, confusion clouded her expression. Then awareness arrived. Her eyes widened. She immediately realized where she was, and whose shoulder she had been sleeping on. Mortification flooded across her face. She sat upright so quickly that her laptop nearly slipped from her lap. "Oh my God," she said. "I am so sorry." The words tumbled out automatically. Then she noticed something, a bruise, dark, fresh, visible beneath the sleeve of Caleb's jacket. Her apology stopped halfway through. She stared at the injury, then at him, then back at the bruise. Understanding arrived all at once. The turbulence, his position, the jacket covering her shoulders, the pieces assembled themselves instantly. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Grace found her voice. "Why didn't you wake me?" Caleb glanced down at the bruise, then shrugged as if the answer were obvious. "You were sleeping." He slipped his jacket back on. It seemed important. Grace stared at him. Something about the simplicity of the response unsettled her. Not because it was complicated, because it wasn't. There was no hidden motive, no expectation, no transaction, no attempt to gain favor. Just kindness, pure and uncomplicated. And somehow that made it far more difficult for her to understand. As the plane descended toward New York, Grace found herself looking out the window. But for the first time in days, she wasn't thinking about shareholders, or board meetings, or quarterly projections. She was thinking about the stranger beside her, and she had no idea that this flight was only the beginning. The flight landed at JFK just after sunrise. A pale orange glow stretched across the horizon as passengers stood, collected their belongings, and prepared to disappear back into their separate lives. Grace fully expected that to be the end of the story. One strange flight, one unusually kind stranger, nothing more. That was how life usually worked. People crossed paths, then they moved on. Yet as she waited for the aisle to clear, she found herself glancing toward Caleb more than once. Not because of his appearance, not because of curiosity, because she still couldn't make sense of him. The world Grace lived in operated according to invisible contracts. Every favor carried an expectation. Every relationship involved leverage. Every act of generosity came with a cost that revealed itself later. She had spent years learning that lesson, sometimes painfully. But Caleb Ryan didn't seem to fit any of those rules. When the line finally began moving, Grace reached for her carry-on bag stored above her seat. The suitcase refused to budge. One of the wheels had become wedged inside the compartment. She pulled once, twice, nothing. Before she could try again, Caleb reached up. With a simple adjustment, he freed the bag and lowered it carefully into her hands. "Here you go. Thank you," Grace said. Instinctively, she reached for her wallet. The movement happened before she even thought about it. Caleb immediately shook his head. No need. Just 2 words. No hesitation. No interest in compensation. No interest in recognition. Then he stepped aside. The interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet somehow, it left Grace feeling strangely uncomfortable. Not because he had helped her, because he wanted absolutely nothing in return. As passengers exited into the terminal, Grace should have continued toward the private car waiting outside. Instead, she slowed, then stopped. A few yards ahead, Caleb's phone rang. He answered immediately. A video call. The moment the screen connected, a small face appeared, a little girl. Bright eyes, messy hair, a smile big enough to light up the entire terminal. "Daddy!" The excitement in her voice was impossible to miss. Grace hadn't intended to listen, but the airport noise wasn't enough to hide the conversation. "Hey, Bug," Caleb said. The warmth in his voice surprised her. It was completely different from the quiet, reserved man she had spent 6 hours sitting beside. "My heart didn't hurt as much today," the little girl announced proudly. "The doctor said that's good." Caleb's face softened. "That's very good." Then came a much more serious question. "Did you remember the moon cookies?" For a brief second, Grace saw genuine panic cross his face. Then he laughed. "I didn't forget." The little girl nodded solemnly. "Good." As if the fate of the world depended on moon cookies. The call continued for another minute, then ended. Caleb tucked away his phone and headed toward the exit. He never noticed Grace standing there, watching, thinking, wondering. Something about the conversation stayed with her, especially the little girl's voice, and the way Caleb's entire demeanor changed when speaking to her. Grace eventually climbed into the back seat of her waiting car. The city rushed past the windows. Emails continued arriving. Meetings continued appearing on her calendar. The world resumed exactly as it had before, but for some reason she kept thinking about a systems technician and his daughter. 3 days passed, then 4. The memory should have faded. Instead, it became harder to ignore. Finally, Grace did something she rarely did. She acted on curiosity. Late Monday morning, she called her assistant. "I need information on someone." Her assistant blinked. Grace almost never asked for personal background searches. What kind of information? Basic profile. Employment history. She paused. "His name is Caleb Ryan." The investigation took less than a day. When the file arrived on her desk, Grace expected something ordinary. She was right, mostly. No criminal record, no major debts, no scandals, no social media obsession, no suspicious activity, no obvious agenda. In fact, the report described someone almost invisible by modern standards. A hardworking technician, a devoted father, a man who seemed to spend every waking hour either working or caring for his daughter. Yet one detail caught Grace's attention. 7 years earlier, Caleb had worked for a technology infrastructure company called Meridian Corp. According to archived records, he had helped design an advanced network routing architecture that later generated millions in licensing revenue. But his name never appeared on the final patent, never appeared in public recognition, never appeared anywhere that mattered. Grace read the section twice, then a third time. The more she examined it, the stranger it became. The timeline suggested Caleb had performed much of the foundational work. Yet someone else had received the credit. Someone else had received the rewards. And when he challenged the decision legally, he lost. The file became even darker afterward. Only months later came Lily's diagnosis: hospitalizations, medical debt, a marriage that eventually collapsed under pressure. Grace sat alone in her office reading the report. Outside her glass walls, hundreds of employees moved through their workdays. Phones rang, meetings happened, deadlines approached. But for several minutes, Grace simply stared at one photograph attached near the end of the file. It had been taken in a hospital waiting room. Caleb sat beside a young Lily. She looked tired. He looked exhausted. Yet he was smiling at her. Not because he felt okay. Not because he wasn't afraid. Because she needed him to. Grace couldn't explain why the image affected her so strongly. Perhaps because she recognized something. Not his circumstances. Not his struggles. The loneliness. The quiet endurance. The habit of carrying pain without showing it. For years, she had done the same thing. Only her battlefield had looked different. She leaned back in her chair. For the first time all day, she ignored her computer screen, ignored her phone, ignored the endless demands waiting for her attention. And she found herself asking a question she hadn't expected. What kind of person goes through all of that and still worries more about a stranger getting sleep on an airplane than about himself? The answer didn't come. But fate, as it turned out, wasn't finished bringing their worlds together. Only a week after that flight, a crisis would erupt inside Holloway Dynamics. A crisis that would threaten millions of dollars, expose hidden incompetence, and place Caleb Ryan directly back into Grace Holloway's life. Neither of them knew it yet, but the next time they met, everything would begin to change. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories of resilience, kindness, and unexpected human connections to viewers around the world. Now let's see what happened when a company-wide emergency forced Grace and Caleb onto the same path once again. 1 week later, Holloway Dynamics was in crisis. At 8:17 on a Tuesday morning, alarms began appearing across the company's internal monitoring systems. At first, the issue seemed minor, a temporary slowdown, nothing unusual. But within 30 minutes, multiple departments reported system failures. Shared databases became inaccessible. Internal communications lagged. Critical software platforms began freezing without warning. By 9 a.m., entire sections of the Manhattan headquarters were operating at reduced capacity. The company's internal IT department rushed into action. Teams flooded the server rooms. Emergency calls filled the hallways. Managers demanded answers. Unfortunately, answers were proving difficult to find. Grace arrived shortly after 9:30. The moment the elevator doors opened onto the technology floor, she knew the situation was serious. People were moving quickly. Conversations were tense. Several senior executives stood outside the server room waiting for updates. Inside, Garrett Benson, the director of IT, was doing his best to manage the growing panic. "We've isolated the affected nodes," he announced, "but we still don't know what's causing the cascade." "How long?" Grace asked. Garrett hesitated, a hesitation she didn't like. "We're working on it." That wasn't an answer, and both of them knew it. As Grace listened to the discussion, her attention drifted toward the far side of the room. Someone was kneeling beside an open floor panel. A technician, navy work jacket, toolkit beside him, focused entirely on the equipment in front of him. For a second, she didn't recognize him. Then he stood. Caleb Ryan. He had been brought in through an outside maintenance contractor as supplemental support. An afterthought. A backup measure. Someone to assist if needed. At least, that had been the original plan. What nobody realized was that Caleb had already begun finding the actual problem. While the senior staff debated theories, he quietly reviewed the system architecture. He studied diagnostic readings, cross-referenced network loads, verified equipment logs, and then he noticed something everyone else had missed. The failed node being blamed wasn't the source. It was a symptom. The real issue existed elsewhere. A secondary relay installed during a routine upgrade 6 weeks earlier had been improperly configured. Under normal circumstances, the error remained hidden. But under heavy demand conditions, it created a chain reaction throughout the infrastructure. A domino effect. One failure triggering another, and another, and another. Caleb checked the data twice, then a third time. When he was certain, he approached Garrett. "I think the relay junction on level 3 is causing the cascade." Garrett barely looked up. "We already checked distribution systems." Caleb remained calm. "I know. Then why are you bringing it up?" "Because the distribution systems aren't the problem." Garrett frowned. Several nearby technicians glanced toward them. The room grew quieter. "What are you saying?" Caleb pointed toward the diagnostics. "The node failure isn't primary. It's reacting to a relay configuration conflict." Garrett immediately disagreed, but one of the younger engineers pulled up the information Caleb referenced. 30 seconds later, his expression changed. Then another engineer checked, and another. Finally, silence settled over the room. The evidence was clear. Caleb was right. The actual fault had nothing to do with the original diagnosis. The entire response effort had been focused on the wrong target. A technician quickly implemented corrective measures. Within minutes, system stability began returning. The cascade stopped. The threat passed. Millions of dollars in potential losses disappeared. The crisis was over. Grace watched the entire sequence from the doorway. What impressed her wasn't simply that Caleb solved the problem. It was how he handled everything afterward. There was no celebration, no self-congratulation, no attempt to embarrass anyone, no demand for recognition. In fact, as several managers began discussing the solution, some subtly positioned themselves as key contributors. Caleb said nothing. He simply stepped back, gathered his tools, and prepared to leave, as though solving a problem and moving on was the most natural thing in the world. Grace found that oddly fascinating. Most people spent enormous amounts of energy making sure others noticed their competence. Caleb seemed completely uninterested in the process. As she continued watching, something else caught her eye. A small bakery bag sticking out of his backpack. The bag had a crescent moon printed on the side. Moon cookies. Instantly, she remembered the airport conversation, the little girl on the video call, the serious warning not to forget. "Atini promise." And somehow, despite everything happening around him, he hadn't forgotten. The realization affected her more than she expected, because it revealed something important. Caleb didn't merely care about big responsibilities. He cared about small ones too. The promises that many adults dismiss. The details children remember forever. The things that quietly build trust. For a moment, Grace found herself thinking about her own childhood, about board meetings replacing family dinners, about conversations interrupted by business calls, about all the moments ambition had consumed. The feeling surprised her. She wasn't accustomed to reflection, especially not during a crisis. Yet standing there, watching Caleb sling his backpack over one shoulder and prepare to leave, she felt something shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to notice. Almost like a locked door opening slightly. Caleb turned toward the exit and finally noticed her standing there. For a brief second, recognition crossed his face. Then came a small smile. Friendly, natural, unaffected. Nothing about it resembled the reactions Grace usually received from people who recognized her. There was no nervousness, no calculation, no attempt to impress. Just genuine recognition. "Hello," he said. "Hello," Grace replied. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, she found herself smiling back. The conversation lasted less than a minute. A few polite exchanges, nothing extraordinary. Yet after Caleb left, Grace remained standing near the server room entrance, thinking. The system crisis had been resolved. The company was safe. The emergency was over. But her attention wasn't on any of those things anymore. Instead, she found herself wondering about a man who had quietly solved a multi-million-dollar problem, accepted no credit for it, remembered moon cookies for his daughter, and treated strangers with a kindness that seemed to require no reward. For the second time since their flight, Caleb Ryan walked away believing their paths had crossed for the last time. And for the second time, he was completely wrong. Because, before the week was over, Grace Holloway would make a decision that neither of them saw coming. A decision that would pull their lives closer together than either one was prepared for. And once that happened, there would be no turning back. For the next 2 days, Grace tried to focus on work. She failed. Every time she opened a report, her thoughts drifted elsewhere. Every time she entered a meeting, she found herself remembering moments that seemed insignificant, but refused to leave her mind. The way Caleb had quietly solved the infrastructure crisis, the way he had accepted no recognition, the way he had remembered moon cookies, the way he seemed completely uninterested in impressing anyone. It was unfamiliar territory for Grace. Most people she encountered wanted something: a promotion, an investment, access, influence, approval, sometimes all of the above. Years of corporate leadership had trained her to look for hidden motives in every interaction. Yet Caleb continued to present a problem she couldn't solve. The more she learned about him, the less he fit any category she understood. On Thursday afternoon, she finally acted. She called her assistant. "I want to offer someone a consulting position." The assistant looked surprised. Grace rarely involved herself directly in recruitment. Who? Caleb Ryan. Within hours, a formal proposal had been prepared. The terms were generous. Very generous. A 3-month consulting contract, flexible scheduling, premium compensation, remote work options, and explicit accommodation for his daughter's medical needs. Grace reviewed every detail personally. She wanted the offer to be fair, professional, respectful. Nothing about it was charity. Nothing about it was a favor. She genuinely believed the company could benefit from his expertise. The following afternoon, Caleb arrived at headquarters. Grace met him in a conference room overlooking Manhattan. Sunlight reflected from neighboring skyscrapers as she explained the proposal. Caleb listened carefully, never interrupting, never appearing intimidated. When she finished, silence settled between them. Grace waited. Most candidates would have accepted immediately. Some would have tried negotiating. Others would have expressed excitement. Caleb did none of those things. Instead, he smiled politely, then said something Grace wasn't expecting. "No, thank you." For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. "I'm sorry, the offer is generous," Caleb said calmly, "and I appreciate it." He paused, "But I can't accept." Grace stared at him. People did not refuse opportunities like this. Not normally. Not especially people carrying the financial pressures he faced. "May I ask why?" Caleb leaned back slightly. The answer came without hesitation. "My daughter." Grace frowned. The schedule was designed around her needs. "I know. Then what am I missing?" Caleb looked out the window briefly before answering. "When Lily was diagnosed, everything changed." His voice remained steady. "I spent a long time chasing bigger opportunities because I thought more money would solve everything." A faint smile touched his face. Sometimes it helped. Then, the smile faded. "But sometimes it cost things I couldn't get back." Grace listened quietly. "Now I measure opportunities differently." "How?" "Time." The single word lingered in the room. Caleb continued, "If something takes me away from her more than it gives back, it's not worth it." Grace had no immediate response, because the statement challenged assumptions she had built her entire life around. In her world, success required sacrifice. Always. Longer hours, more pressure, less personal time. That was the price. Everyone knew it, or so she had believed. Yet sitting across from her was a man who had consciously chosen a different equation, and somehow seemed at peace with it. "There are other reasons too," Caleb added. "What reasons?" He considered the question carefully, then answered honestly. "I've spent time in environments where people were treated like assets instead of human beings." His tone wasn't accusatory. It wasn't directed at Grace personally. It sounded more like a lesson learned through experience. "I promised myself I wouldn't go back to that." The words struck harder than he intended. because Grace immediately recognized the uncomfortable truth hidden inside them. Too many corporations worked exactly that way, including, at times, her own. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Caleb stood. The meeting was over. No negotiation, no leverage, no attempt to increase the offer. His decision was final. Grace accompanied him toward the elevators. Something about the interaction felt unfinished, as though she had encountered a perspective she wasn't yet capable of fully understanding. Just before the elevator doors opened, Caleb turned toward her. "Thank you for refusing the job?" Grace asked dryly. A laugh escaped him. The sound surprised her. "You offered it for the right reasons." The elevator arrived. The doors opened. Then he added something she would remember long afterward. "That matters more than most people realize." With that, he stepped inside. The doors closed, and he was gone. Grace remained standing in the hallway, alone, thinking. A strange feeling settled over her. Not disappointment, not frustration. Something else. Respect. Deep and genuine respect. Because for perhaps the first time in years, she had encountered someone who couldn't be influenced by status, couldn't be impressed by money, couldn't be persuaded by power. Someone whose priorities were so clear that even an opportunity many people would consider life-changing failed to move them. That evening, Grace found herself driving across the city without a destination. The skyline glowed against the darkening sky. Traffic crawled through crowded streets. Yet her thoughts remained fixed on one question. What kind of life creates a man like Caleb Ryan? She didn't know, but she was beginning to realize something important. The more she learned about him, the more she questioned the life she had built for herself. And that realization frightened her, because once certain questions enter your mind, they become impossible to ignore. Questions about success, about happiness, about what truly matters. And Grace Holloway was only beginning to ask them. She had no idea that very soon, circumstances would bring her face to face, not only with Caleb again, but also with the small girl who had quietly become the center of his entire world. And that meeting would change everything. Over the next several weeks, what began as an occasional visit slowly became a routine. At first, Grace still pretended there were practical reasons for stopping by. A project update, a technical question, a conversation she happened to be having in the neighborhood. The excuses became harder to believe with each visit, especially because Caleb never challenged them. He simply welcomed her in, and Lily stopped pretending altogether. By the third week, Lily had started setting an extra place at the table whenever Grace was expected. By the fourth week, she had begun introducing her as Coco Grace, a nickname whose origin nobody fully understood but which Lily insisted was perfectly logical. Grace stopped asking. Some things, she learned, only made sense in Lily's universe. One Saturday evening, the three of them sat on the living room floor eating pizza. Because Lily had declared that dining tables were for boring people, neither adult argued. The conversation drifted from cartoons to space exploration to whether dragons would make good babysitters. Somehow, Lily connected all three subjects with complete confidence. Grace found herself laughing harder than she had in years. The sound surprised her every time. Across the room, Caleb noticed. He didn't comment, but he noticed. For a long time, Grace had worn seriousness like armor. Here, for the first time, she occasionally forgot to put it on. One evening after Lily had fallen asleep, the conversation turned more personal. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. The city hummed quietly outside. Caleb sat on the couch, while Grace occupied the armchair across from him. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then Caleb broke the silence. Dana left because she couldn't handle what happened to Lily. Grace listened carefully. It was the first time he had spoken openly about his former marriage. There was no bitterness in his voice. No anger, just honesty. "Do you hate her?" Grace asked. Caleb considered the question, then slowly shook his head. "I used to." His eyes drifted toward Lily's bedroom door. "Eventually I realized carrying that anger wasn't helping Lily." Grace looked down. The answer unsettled her. Not because it was wrong, because she wasn't sure she could do the same. For years, she had carried anger toward people who had betrayed her, toward board members who doubted her, toward competitors who attacked her, toward Marcus, especially Marcus, the former boyfriend who had used their relationship to gain access to sensitive business information before leaving for a competitor. Even now, thinking about it created a familiar tightness in her chest. Caleb seemed to notice, "You don't have to forgive people immediately." Grace looked up. "But eventually," he smiled slightly. "Eventually you deserve peace more than they deserve space in your head." The words stayed with her long after she returned home. A week later, Grace shared something she had never told anyone. Not her executives, not her friends, not even her father's closest associates. She admitted she hadn't cried at his funeral. Caleb looked surprised. "I had a board meeting 2 hours later," she explained quietly, "so I didn't." The silence that followed felt heavy. "I kept telling myself I'd deal with it later." "And did you?" Grace stared toward the window. "No." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb said something simple. "That sounds exhausting." "Not dramatics." Not judgmental, just true. And for reasons she couldn't explain, tears filled her eyes. Because it was exhausting. It had been exhausting for years. Yet she had become so accustomed to carrying the weight that she barely noticed it anymore. Their relationship continued growing in ways neither had anticipated. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just steadily, naturally, like two people gradually discovering that they understood each other better than either expected. Then, everything changed. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday morning. At 6:43 a.m., Holloway Dynamics detected a significant cybersecurity breach. Within hours, the situation escalated into a full-scale corporate emergency. Sensitive client information had been accessed. Internal systems had been compromised. Financial markets reacted immediately. By opening bell, the company's stock price had dropped sharply. News organizations began asking questions. Investors demanded answers. Board members panicked. Grace returned to the version of herself the world knew best: focused, precise, controlled. Inside the executive war room, she directed response teams with military efficiency. For 48 hours, she barely slept. Yet beneath the professional crisis lurked something far more dangerous. Someone inside the company appeared responsible, and evidence was beginning to point toward an unexpected target: Saleb. Initially, the suggestion seemed absurd. Grace dismissed it immediately. But as more reports emerged, pressure mounted. Audit trails, access logs, internal documentation. Everything appeared to place Caleb near critical systems during key moments. The evidence wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to create suspicion. Enough for certain people to start asking questions. One of those people was Sebastian Cole, a senior board member Grace had never fully trusted. Sebastian handled the situation with disturbing enthusiasm. Every meeting seemed to return to the same topic. Every discussion somehow circled back toward Caleb's involvement. The pattern didn't escape Grace, nor did it escape Caleb. When he learned what was happening, he wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was disappointed, which somehow felt worse. One evening, after another difficult day, Caleb sat at his kitchen table reading yet another article speculating about the breach. The story didn't directly accuse him, but it didn't need to. It planted doubt, suggested possibilities, asked questions without providing answers. The damage was already occurring. Lily sat nearby coloring quietly, completely unaware of the storm gathering around her father. Caleb looked at her, then at the article, then back at her, and made a decision. The following morning, he called Grace. "I think I should step back." The words hit her like a physical blow. "No." "Grace." "No." She stood outside her office window, overlooking Manhattan, arms crossed, voice tight. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know." "Then why would you leave?" Caleb sighed softly, because unlike her, he had already accepted something. "This isn't about being right." "Then what is it about?" "The company." She stared at him through the phone. "The story is growing." His voice remained calm. "The longer I'm involved, the more attention it receives. The truth was infuriating precisely because it made sense. Thousands of employees depended on the company's stability. Investors, clients, families. The controversy threatened all of them. Grace understood the logic. She hated it. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "You know I'm innocent." "I do." "Then trust that this is the right decision." The conversation ended shortly afterward. Grace stood alone in her office, long after the call, looking out at the city, feeling something she hadn't expected. Loss. Not because he was gone, because she suddenly realized how much his presence had come to matter. Across Brooklyn, Caleb sat beside Lily while she proudly explained why a dragon needed roller skates. He listened carefully, smiling when appropriate, as if everything were normal. But deep inside, he wondered whether he had just walked away from something far more important than either of them fully understood. Neither knew it yet, but the conspiracy surrounding the breach was much larger than anyone suspected. And within days, the truth would begin emerging. When it did, it wouldn't just clear Caleb's name. It would expose a betrayal capable of shaking Holloway Dynamics to its foundation and force Grace to make the most important decision of her life. The truth came out faster than anyone expected. The investigation uncovered a carefully orchestrated scheme that had been building for months. Evidence revealed that Sebastian Cole had manipulated internal reports, fabricated portions of the audit trail, and used his influence to redirect suspicion away from the real source of the breach. When federal investigators became involved, the case collapsed quickly. Sebastian was removed from the board. Several executives resigned. The company's reputation survived. But for Grace Holloway, something far more important had changed. For the first time in years, she no longer measured her life solely by quarterly reports, stock prices, or corporate victories. She had spent so long climbing that she had forgotten to ask herself why she was climbing in the first place. A few weeks later, Lily's surgery was finally performed. The hours in the waiting room felt endless. Grace sat beside Caleb the entire time. Neither spoke much. There were no speeches, no dramatic promises, just quiet support, the kind that matters most. Then the surgeon appeared. One word changed everything. Textbook. The procedure had gone perfectly. For several seconds, Caleb simply sat there, motionless, as though his mind needed time to process the fact that years of fear had finally loosened their grip. Then he lowered his head into his hands, not because he was breaking, because he no longer had to stay strong every second. Grace rested her hand over his, and together they sat in silence, letting relief speak for itself. Weeks later, Lily returned home healthy, energetic, and determined to make up for every missed adventure. Then came one final surprise. When Grace arrived at Reed Street Park one afternoon, she discovered a brand new playground built near the children's hospital. Wide ramps, accessible play areas, safe spaces for recovering children. Families filled the park. Children laughed, parents smiled, and near the entrance stood a small sign explaining that the project had been funded through a charitable foundation. Only later did Grace learn the truth. The money she had secretly arranged to help Caleb had not been spent on himself. It had not been spent on luxury, or comfort, or convenience. He had used it to build something for other families, for children who were still fighting the battles Lily had already survived. Grace stood there looking at the playground, and finally understood. What made Caleb extraordinary wasn't a single act of kindness. It was consistency, the quiet decision, repeated every day, to put compassion ahead of self-interest, to help even when nobody was watching, to remain good even when life had given him every excuse not to. As the afternoon sun filtered through the trees, Lily raced across the playground and waved toward them. "Come on," Grace laughed. Caleb smiled, and for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt the need to look anywhere else. Because sometimes the greatest success isn't building a company. It's building a life filled with people worth coming home to. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that kindness still exists in the world. And tell us in the comments, what part of Caleb and Grace's story inspired you the most? Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and never underestimate the power of one small act of kindness. Sometimes, it can change everything.